has been little more than a disgraceful story of imperialism, exploitation, racism, sexism and other forms of discrimination. I take a very different view.
The stereotype of genocide in the average Australian mind, or even in the minds that ought to know better, is of the sort of striped pajamaed ones hanging off the wire at Auschwitz, or it's the serried rows of skulls in Cambodia, or it's the pango-wielding Hutu chasing the Tutsis in some kind of crazed tribal African affair, or it's some kind of megalomaniacal Serbian who's trying to eliminate Bosnian Muslims and so on. That's genocide in the eyes of the general public. The fact is that Australia has been at this in a much more consistent and systematic way over a period of, what is it now, nearly 210 years, as opposed to genocide occurring in neat, tight, compacted time frames, such as Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, or Stalin's genocide between the two world wars, or Rwanda 1994. We all expect genocide to be compacted into an observable time frame, and one that is televisable, for example, on the evening news.
This is Pauline Hanson, leader of the racist One Nation Party, which in the last federal election got 1 million votes. That's 10% of the electorate.
A significant number of Australians, 25% of the voters in Queensland and 1 million voters federally, did not find that so objectionable that it would prevent them voting for One Nation. They didn't all vote for that policy. They didn't, however, find it so extreme that they would vote against One Nation. And that, to that extent, I think that is one of the most disturbing things that's come out of this. That where else in a Western democracy could you go to the electorate and say, we are going to take away the property rights of, say, a minority. We're going to expropriate them completely. Where else could you do that and still, however, win a significant block of the votes?
When Pauline Hanson lost her seat in the 1998 federal election, her influence was said to have passed. But Hanson was always a distraction, for the real threat came not from the margins of Australian political life, but from respectable mainstream politicians adept at swaying with the breezes of racism.
This generation.
Prime Minister Howard and Pauline Hanson have much in common. Both deny the truth of Australia's bloody past, which Howard derides as the black armband version of history. And Hanson's One Nation Party bears similarity to Howard's One Australia policy from the late 1980s, which attacked the country's multicultural society. As Prime Minister, one of Howard's first acts was to cut $400 million from the Aboriginal budget. Adult education for Aborigines is being cut back, and his government has said no to a treaty with its First People, the kind that governments all over the world have negotiated with their Indigenous population. The truth about John Howard's Australia might be found in the unprecedented number of critical international reports that document Australia's disastrous human rights record towards its minority people. I asked the Prime Minister for an interview, but he declined. In a political move clearly aimed at heading off international criticism and an Aboriginal shaming campaign in the run-up to the Olympics, John Howard has now acknowledged what he calls a blemish on the nation's history. His expression of regret pointedly contained no apology. Much of the poverty and disease in the Aboriginal community, says the Australian Medical Association, is the result of the dispossession of their lands. The Aborigines are perhaps the longest human presence on Earth. Their very sense of being is tied to the ancient land of Australia, a country the British called the land of no one, in order to justify the dispossession of its people. Since then, what the Aboriginal people have got from Australian governments have been promises and betrayal. In 1992, the High Court ruled that Aborigines were entitled to the same land rights that white Australians enjoyed under the common law. The following year, the government of Paul Keating gave limited native title to Aborigines while protecting the interests of mining companies and big landholders. When the High Court reinforced its original decision, the newly elected Howard government enacted legislation that effectively cut back these fragile gains. Nothing like this legislation has been passed in a modern parliament. No other government in the democratic world has set out to remove what are common law land rights. It means, in effect, the theft from one group of Australians, the Indigenous people, of property rights that the High Court had ruled were theirs. The object is to advantage another group, most of whom happen to be white and well off. This is being done by a kind of legal attrition, as new and complex regulations are interpreted differently in the 6 Australian states, a tactic long familiar to Aborigines seeking justice.
Now, if it were suggested that the government expropriate the property of Chinese Australians by saying they own too much, they've got too much, we will take their property away, it would be seen as a policy of extreme racism and such an extraordinary policy that it would be either reviled or laughed out of court.
Australia's popular image is that of an egalitarian nation built on mateship. But who really owns this vast island continent? The richest land is controlled by just 25 powerful landholders. They include Donald MacDonald, federal president of the National Party in John Howard's ruling coalition, and Kerry Packer, Australia's richest man, seen here with his mate Bob Hawke, then the Labor Prime Minister. And here is Packer with his new mate, John Howard. Between them, Packer and Rupert Murdoch control much of the Australian media. Murdoch, another wealthy landholder, owns almost 70% of the capital city press. And this is where Australia's elite lives, beside the splendours of Sydney Harbour. That's Murdoch's sacred site, when he's in town. And that's Packer's, whose walls are so high he won't see the Olympic torch when it passes nearby. While Aboriginal land claims are often disputed, the land rights of the wealthy never are. Among the lesser members of the elite are the lawyers, accountants, consultants and wheeler dealers who control and run the Sydney Olympics. The Australian Olympic Committee is guaranteed a profit of more than $100 million, and their deals are covered by official secrecy, thanks to legislation especially amended by the New South Wales government. They've used the Aborigines as marketing gimmicks, and the boomerang is the motive of the Olympics. White Australia has long appropriated the culture and artefacts of the Aboriginal dreaming. The facts of Aboriginal life and death will not, they hope, disturb the facade. This is a nation of extraordinary contradictions. Unlike the United States, the first white Australians were not on a mission from God, but were God-forsaken, like my own great-great-grandparents who came as convicts in leg irons. This was said to give us a natural empathy with the underdog, the battler. Perhaps. Certainly when the immigrant ships arrived in the 1950s, and little Belfasts and little Cypresses and little Lebanon sprung up, there was no blood on the streets. It didn't matter that we got on by default, because most of us agreed there was no better place a battler could go. And this surely stands as Australia's greatest achievement. In my lifetime, this country has become one of the most culturally diverse societies in the world, and it's happened peacefully. The exceptions, are those Australians who were here before any of us. Australia is not merely its politicians and fat cats. Among many ordinary people, there is a great desire to extend the decency and openness of their multicultural society by making amends for the crimes committed against the Aboriginal people. This is the Sea of Hands campaign brought to Bondi Beach. Each hand carries a name and symbolises white opposition to the government's policies on black land rights. It's part of a grassroots movement of regret and reconciliation. What it says is that many Australians are no longer prepared to be innocent bystanders in their own country. But symbols and gestures are not justice.
The real game is, you know, the poverty-stricken situation of Aboriginal people, the lack of courage on the part of this government to say sorry, the determination on the part of significant minority section in Australian society to accept Aboriginal people and the reality of history. That's the real game, and the next part to that is to bloody well do something about it.
Only they, wrote Primo Levi of the Holocaust survivors, by their unique experience, are immersed in the truth. White Australians should listen to Aboriginal survivors, to the writers, teachers, elders, historians, artists and activists who are part of an extraordinary renaissance. What they demand is the political will for a treaty that will bring land and justice. No matter how successful the Sydney Olympics turn out to be, no matter how glittering the showcase, in the end, civilizations are judged by how they treat all their people, especially the most vulnerable, who are often the bravest. Given Australian democracy and its self-image of decency, given its wealth and brains, why is it not possible for a nation's leaders to behave honourably towards less than 2% of the population? Set against this question, the issue of whether or not Australia becomes a republic in the 21st century is simply irrelevant. For until the first Australians are given back their nationhood, the rest of us can never claim our own.